Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Jackson and the focus is a new kind of president. The year is 1829 and the masses have shown up in force in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the arrival of Andrew Jackson and his inauguration as the 7th President of the United States. Jackson himself is still in mourning. He had lost his wife of more than 30 years just a couple of months before when she died, just before they were set to leave from Tennessee. But his followers were reveling in the excitement of having a man of the people, the man they put into the office of the Presidency of the United States, take that oath and take over the seat of government. It was a wild scene at the time. It was described as it was like the inundation of the northern barbarians into Rome, save that the tumultuous tide came in from a different point of the compass, a lot of that point coming from the western part of the United States that was proud to have their man in the White House. Well, things were going to be different for the presidency under Andrew Jackson. He was going to be a different kind of president across several dimensions on how he'd use the patronage, the veto. So there would be scandals, his style, and even the role of the president in the American system of government itself. Jackson felt a kinship with the people, the masses of the people. In fact, he believed he was their direct representative, and this was a new way of thinking for the American president. He believed the president was more representative of the national will than the Congress, and he was going to act accordingly, not just being deferential to Congress or the courts, these other branches of government, on what they decide to do and simply be the one to enforce those laws or decisions. He was going to act in what he believed to be the best interest of the people, and if that meant he was going to be at odds with those other branches, then so be it. Jackson also really wanted to make sure in his mind he wasn't just a president of the rich, which he thought some maybe of his predecessors had done. He was going to be the president of all the people. When he was governor of Florida for a brief period, he made the observation that just laws can make no distinction of privilege between the rich and poor, and that when men of high standing attempt to trample upon the rights of the weak, they are fittest objects for example and punishment. In general, the great can protect themselves, but the poor and humble require the arm and shielding of the law. Jackson was from that background, the poor and humble, and he was bound and determined to look out for the interests of the poor and humble across the country. They were his people, he was theirs. A kinship had developed, and this would be part of his view of Jacksonian democracy, which was again the expansion of the franchise, giving more people the opportunity to weigh in on who would be representing them in the American system of government, and the president's responsibility to be the eyes and ears of those people in that system of government, which again was a different way of thinking. Jackson, like all presidents, starts out with naming his cabinet, but he used his cabinet completely differently than anybody had in the past. He only had a couple of people he really knew in the cabinet: John Eaton, Secretary of War, and Martin Van Buren, whom he gotten to know during the recent campaign. He gave the top spot of Secretary of State. The other advisors, the party had kind of recommended some people. He was okay with them, but it didn't really matter because he wasn't going to pay much attention to the cabinet. Jackson was always taking his own counsel, as he had throughout his career. He wasn't going to listen much to these senior advisors, although Van Buren he did listen to a fair amount, because Van Buren was sort of welcome into his unofficial advisors, what he called his kitchen cabinet, his buddies, the people he liked to hang out with. They would hash out some ideas, but of course the decision always made by Andrew Jackson. Some of those decisions had to do with appointments beyond just the cabinet, as the president had the authority to fire and hire thousands of presidential appointees to fill out the ranks of the government service. In the past, some presidents had made wholesale changes, some had not. It had kind of gone back and forth, but Jackson was the one who said, sort of as policy, rotation in office is good. That's what he called it, rotation in office. You know, it's good to have more people come in. It's the democratic thing to do. Give other people a chance to serve their government. And oh, by the way, if that means I can have my partisans working for me, that's a good thing too. And that's exactly what happened, as he turned out hundreds and hundreds of political appointees and brought in his own supporters. Senator William Marcy of New York at the time described it as, "To the victor belongs the spoils." And the spoils system, that's where it got its name, became the commonplace mode of presidential patronage for the next 50 years. It really started firmly with Jackson as a proactive policy to use the power of patronage to get your own supporters into office to support you and to reward your supporters with getting those positions as well. One of the many changes that Jackson put into place. Another thing Jackson did differently was the use of the veto. Now, Jackson believed, like many of his predecessors, that federally funded internal improvements like roads and bridges and canals, these were unconstitutional to be done with federal tax dollars, particularly if they were only for an individual state's benefit. But when Jackson vetoed his first internal improvement bill, it wasn't really over constitutional concerns. It was over policy concerns. He didn't want to spend the money. One of his big things was he was going to drive down that federal debt as much as he could, and he didn't want to spend federal tax dollars on something that was only going to benefit an individual state. Prior to Jackson, there had been 6 presidents who had issued 10 vetoes. All 10 were for constitutional concerns. Jackson was the first to issue a veto over policy concerns, and he would issue a dozen vetoes, more than his predecessors combined, during his 8 years in office, and they were all pretty much based on policy differences. What did this mean? Congress now had to worry about the interests of the White House when it was formulating bills. They weren't going to get objections just for constitutional concerns. If there were policy concerns, they might actually have to work together in putting legislation on the table that a president would support. That had not been the case before Andrew Jackson, and it has certainly been the case ever since Andrew Jackson. Well, one of the most important bills that was working its way through Congress in Jackson's mind was something that was called the Indian Removal Act. This was in 1830. In fact, Jackson staked the success of his administration upon this measure. It was that important to him. Jackson had been a product of the Indian engagement with the white man in the Western territories of the United States out on the frontier for most of his adult life, and frankly, it was not a great experience for him. He had spent much of that time hunting down Indians, killing them, battling with them, rarely in friendly intercourse, and he believed that it was no longer practical to have Indians living amongst the white man, and the best thing to do was to have them relocate. He actually looked at 3 options in his mind as what to do with the Indians. One was the Indians could assimilate, which was unlikely as he knew, and most of the Indian tribes did not want to assimilate. They had resisted that move, but he saw that as at least an option. A second option is if the Indians wanted to, they could stay right where they were, but they would be subject to state laws, and his federal government wasn't going to help them. And so if the states wanted to enforce some kind of terrible rules upon them, that was their choice if they wanted to stay within the bounds of that state, because his federal government wasn't going to support. The only other option was relocation. If they weren't going to assimilate and it was impractical to stay within the states without the support of the federal government, he was driving them to this only other option, which was relocation. He needed some federal authority, and he got it with the Indian Removal Act, which basically gave the president the ability to abrogate prior treaties, renegotiate, and put some new treaties in place that would take land from the Indians on the eastern side of the Mississippi, wherever it may be, and give them land somewhere out there on the western side of the Mississippi in some new territory where the Indians could have the land and they could have their own culture. And Jackson thought this would be a good thing. The Indians will like this. Sure, it's inconvenient to move, but this is the only way they're going to keep their heritage together. It'll be safer. Jackson went foursquare to support the Indian Removal Act, and when it passed, he went to implement it. Well, some of the tribes eventually gave in. They said, look, there's nothing we can do and we'll relocate, but some refused. And they went to the courts, and a case, Worcester v. Georgia, was one of these cases that went to the United States Supreme Court questioning the ability of states to impose their will on Indian tribes. And John Marshall's court agreed with the Indians that they were a unique character within the overall system of the United States, and that states had no sovereignty over them. Only the federal government had the authority to work with these Indian tribes. And so this state law was unconstitutional. The problem was Andrew Jackson decided he's not going to enforce the ruling of the court. Horace Greeley, as a newspaper editor at the time, quoted Jackson. I say quotes in air quotes because it wasn't really a quote, but he paraphrased probably, that said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." It's a great quote, but it was never really said by Jackson. But Jackson did say something pretty darn similar. In a letter to John Coffey, his friend, he had written, "The decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, and they find that they cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate." Well, no kidding. The courts have no enforcement power. That was the job of the executive. But that's not how Andrew Jackson saw it. He believed he could ignore the rulings of the court, not enforce this decision. Eventually, this one actually found its way to being resolved about a year later. But in general, it brought out this belief that Jackson kind of felt he was on an island as president and he could kind of do what he wants. He said at the time, "The opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges, and on that point, the president is independent of both. The authority of the Supreme Court must not therefore be permitted to control the Congress or the executive when acting in their legislative capacities, but to have only such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve." In other words, if I don't like their reasoning, I don't have to follow them. This was one of the more monarchical things that Jackson had ever said, and his implications were significant. Where does the president stand in these co-equal branches of government? According to Jackson, he had independence, but also could ignore these other rulings if he so choose. And in his mind, this was perfectly natural because he was the representative of the people. This, again, was his view of democracy. Others view it purely as despotism. As an individual putting himself above the law, above the legislature, above the courts, he was creating a king-like environment. But these were the diametrically opposed views of Andrew Jackson. In terms of the Indians, he moved out aggressively on their removal. And interestingly enough, he continued to believe it was in their best interest. Jackson said, "Toward the aborigines of the country, no one can indulge a more friendly feeling than myself, or would go further in attempting to reclaim them from their wandering habits and make them a happy, prosperous people." This is one of the most disingenuous comments that any president of the United States has ever made. I mean, he might have convinced himself of that, but certainly none of his actions portrayed this kind of approach. The removals that were supposed to be done by mutually agreed upon treaty were effectively forced upon these Indians, giving them no choice. Thousands and thousands, about 45,000 on his watch, were relocated across the Mississippi. Many thousands died on the way, and this would continue into Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren's administration, in what would be called the Trail of Tears. There were no tears shed by Andrew Jackson because he thought this was a good thing. Clearly, it was not the way it was carried out, the principle associated with it. But again, Jackson had his mind made up, and he executed accordingly. There was also, under Jackson's watch, the first sex scandal in presidential history. Let's give it some context. Peggy Eaton was the wife of John Eaton, the Secretary of War, and Peggy Eaton had a bit of a checkered past. In fact, her husband had just committed suicide, her previous husband, just before she and Eaton got together, but her past and her reputation had gone back decades about some service that she had done in a boarding house. In any case, the other wives of the cabinet members refused to meet with Peggy Eaton. And this was a big deal. This had never been done before, and it created all kinds of chaos in the cabinet. It started with Floride Calhoun, the wife of the vice president, who again simply would not meet with Peggy Eaton. Well, the rest of the cabinet wives followed. Andrew Jackson was at his wit's end because he could control almost anyone, it seemed like, except the wives of his cabinet members, and they were causing all kinds of problems because this was infiltrating within the cabinet itself. Jackson was a staunch defender of his friends, John and Peggy Eaton. He said Mrs. Eaton is as chaste as those who slander her, and that he would sink with honor to my grave before I would abandon my friend. This had become an item of principle for Jackson, and he wasn't going to give in, but neither were these wives. And it went on for weeks and months, and it was highly disruptive. Even Jackson's inner family, his niece, Emily Donelson, who was there with her husband, who was Jackson's personal secretary, part of his close family that were with him in the White House. Emily Donelson refused to meet with Peggy Eaton, and this one Jackson could do something about. He sent his niece and her family home. He said, look, is my White House. As long as you're not going to be engaging with Peggy Eaton, then you're not welcome. That was one tack that he could take. But he was getting no support from any of his cabinet members except one. Martin Van Buren, who happened to be a widower, and Jackson was really starting to like this gentleman who had helped him so much during his campaign. Jackson had said to John Coffey about Van Buren that I have found him everything that I could desire him, Van Buren, to be. Instead of being selfish and intriguing, as has been represented by some of his opponents, I have ever found him frank, open, candid, and manly. As a counselor, he is able and prudent, Republican in his principles, and one of the most pleasant men to do business with I ever saw. Van Buren loved Jackson. Jackson was starting to admire Van Buren, and Van Buren was the only one who wanted to try to really solve the Peggy Eaton problem. And eventually he did. And it took another unprecedented act. Van Buren and Jackson were off on a ride one day when Van Buren, they were stopping at a rest, and he said to his president that there is only one way to solve this problem. And he started by saying, I will resign, I, Van Buren. And Jackson was, no, what are you talking about? You're my valued Secretary of State. Why would I let you resign? But then Van Buren continued. He had it all thought out. If he resigned, then John Eaton could resign without losing any face by being the only one to resign. That would take Peggy Eaton out of the equation. But more importantly, that would give Jackson the ability to insist on the resignation of the entire cabinet. And that's eventually what Jackson agreed to. Van Buren stepped aside, Eaton stepped aside, and Jackson basically forced the resignation of all the other cabinet members, the only time in American presidential history that an entire cabinet resigned effectively at the same time that wasn't at the end of a term. This was, again, a different way of dealing with things, but it actually worked, and there was calm restored into the new cabinet that was put into place. In fact, Emily Donelson and her husband came back to the White House, and things were good there. And as for Martin Van Buren, well, he was out of a job, but not for long. Eventually, he would become vice president and eventually President of the United States. These are just some of the transformational components of the Andrew Jackson presidency. Frankly, the biggest issues are still yet to come, the bank nullification, but those are stories for another day. That is Andrew Jackson and a new kind of president from the life of Andrew Jackson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.